This podcast is part of E2C Network, where we share the whole Auburn experience.
Hello and welcome to War Horses, the only college equestrian podcast that you should trust to tell you how good each team actually is. I'm your host, Auburn Elvis. Let's talk about some college equestrian. So, we had our final week of the regular season this past weekend. So, let's take a look at Week 17's meet recaps. Now, this week started off on Friday with the meet of the week, TCU at SMU. I thought SMU would win in a 9-9 tiebreaker. Here's what really happened. The day started off with equitation on the flat and horsemanship. Flat went 3-2 for SMU, and horsemanship also went 3-2 for SMU. So right there, we could tell this was going to be a different kind of meet. TCU has had the nation's best horsemanship lineup week in, week out, but on Saturday, they got beat. Narrowly, but they got beat just the same. Now, normally that bunch would probably be out there flirting with a 5-0 sweep, so this was big for them not to win the majority of points. Also, it meant that they would be behind 4-6 at the half, and their best event was behind them. Not ideal. Now, the Frogs did rally a bit over fences, but even then they only got the 2-2 stalemate, which meant that everything was going to come down to reining, and they would have to win that at least by 3 points. And I'll tell you, SMU is not the team that you want to face when you have got to win reining by 3 points. Instead, SMU won reining 3-1. So, that extended the final score up to 11-7, giving SMU the upset over the number one team. So yeah, this was a big win for SMU, kept them perfect at home, and has them really on a roll entering the postseason. And they're going to hope that they don't cool off too much, as everyone else but them is going to ride in conference tournaments, while they, as an independent, basically sit at home riding on their own horses, getting ready for Ocala. For TCU, well, we know road meets are tough, and TCU didn't have the toughest road schedule leading up to this one, so this meet kind of realigns some of what we can expect out of the Frogs. But don't get me wrong, they are still at the top of the sport. They're just not unbeatable. After that, we had College of Charleston in a single discipline only meet against Auburn. Now, I predicted this would be 7-1 Auburn. Let's see what really happened. It was a 4-on-4 meet like we thought, and Auburn started about 2 of the less experienced riders in each of these events. Still though, things went heavily for the Tigers. They swept both events 4-0. Now, this was a really good opportunity for those younger riders, like we said, to get out there and show what they could do. For the Cougars, it was a big loss, but it was kind of expected. They were originally going to be riding against Texas A&M the following day, but with some foul weather moving through the area, that meet got canceled, and that meant that College of Charleston's first season had come to an end. They are not going to be competing in a conference tournament this season, but they did mention that they expect to join the ECAC next season, and that they are also going to host a single discipline tournament in that. So we'll look forward to that this time next year. So after that weather cancellation, that meant Saturday's meet featuring Texas A&M at Auburn would be the final regular season meet of the season. Now, I predicted this was going to be a 10-9 win for Texas A&M. Let's see what really happened. The meet started off with flat and raining, as many Auburn meets do. And so you kind of thought, hey, if Auburn could just stay close in the first half, they'd have that chance to win it in the second half. Well, on the flat, things went 3-2 for Auburn, and in raining, it was a 2-2 tie. So it made the halftime score 5-4 Auburn. And honestly, I think if it had been the same score but just flipped where A&M was winning, Auburn still would have been happy with that. So on we go to the second half. In fences, Auburn showed the potential that we've gotten used to for about the last half decade. Auburn won that 4-1, and they basically put themselves 1 point away from victory. And it wouldn't take too long to get that, because in horsemanship, Auburn won that 4-0. So they got the dirty sweep there, and that made the final score 13-5 Auburn. So big win for Auburn. It ended the season on a high note after a string of some uncharacteristic losses. For A&M, obviously they would have liked to have gotten the win, but losing at Auburn doesn't change much for them. They're still going to get the number 1 seed in the SEC tournament, and they're going to avoid Auburn and Georgia in that first round, which is more important than losing one road meet is. So that was all of this week's action. Now let's talk a little bit about the Golden Score Sheet Awards. So this entire season, I have been conducting a contest that I've called the Golden Score Sheet Award. You see, the official score sheets in college equestrian, they have lots of numbers on them and some calculations that have to be performed because the two disciplines use different base point scales. So So these calculations have tripped up some of the school staff members at all around the country various times in the past. And there were some years where it had gotten pretty bad where you could find a lot of mistakes on these official score sheets. So I started this competition as a way to highlight the teams that do their score sheets well, because up until this point, I had really only been talking about the ones who made the mistakes. So I wanted to highlight the score sheets that were good. So each week I review the score sheets and I judge them based on how close to perfect they are. And I'll admit that I can get very picky with these deductions because perfection is the goal here. And now that we've come to the end of the regular season, I have tallied up all the deductions and the bonuses to see which school or schools had the best score sheets this season. And I will be mailing an actual award to the winning team recognizing their achievement and outstanding records keeping. But since I'm still 3D printing the award, I will not announce the winner this week. I'd really like the award to be on its way when the podcast drops, so I'm going to wait until the next podcast where I do the conference tournament previews, and that's when I'm going to announce the winner. But I'll tell you, longtime listeners probably have a pretty good idea of who the winner is. But you don't know, maybe one of the other teams took advantage of a bonus point this past weekend. You'll just have to wait and see. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's now take a look at the official Auburn Elvis College Equestrian rankings. We had some upsets this week, and that's going to cause a few shifts in the rankings. But before we get into those, let's take a second and just talk about how all of this works. A good thing to remember in general is that the good times are never quite as good as they seem, and the bad times are never quite as bad as they seem. So if your team lost, it doesn't mean they suck, and if your team won, it doesn't mean that they're awesome. You really have to look at the entire resume. And when you do that, keep in mind these words of wisdom from your close personal friend Auburn Elvis. Good teams win at home, great teams win on the road. Alright? So keep that in mind because that's going to guide us for how we rank these teams. Okay, so at the top of the rankings, there's this group of 4 teams that are great. Now, because the sport has an unbalanced scheduling mix, you can make a case for almost any of the order between these teams, but this is my show, so here's my order that I place these 4 great teams in. Number 1 is TCU. The Frogs ended the regular season 11-1. They were perfect at home and almost perfect overall, losing in the final week on the road at SMU. The biggest knock against TCU is they didn't ride as challenging of a road schedule as many other teams. Their biggest wins away from home are on the road at Oklahoma State and a neutral site win over Georgia. We don't know for sure if TCU is the best team in the nation, but they have the best resume, so for that reason, they are the number 1 team. Number 2 is SMU. The Mustangs were perfect at home, including this past weekend's big win over TCU. And all of SMU's 4 losses came on the road. Their biggest win of the season is probably their road win at Auburn, and it pretty much balances out their biggest loss, which was on the road at then unranked Fresno State. You could probably make a good case that SMU is the best team in the nation right now, but when you look at their entire resume, I think number 2 is the best spot you could rank them in. The third team in our group of great teams is number 3 overall, Texas A&M. The Aggies have also been perfect at home, and they have a pair of good road wins at South Carolina and at Oklahoma State. I can understand if you believe Texas A&M should be ranked higher, but in my opinion, SMU's win at Auburn is better than those 2 good A&M road wins. But I'll admit that these teams are very close, and I might actually end up swapping them around depending on how A&M performs in the SEC tournament. And rounding out the group is the number 4 team, Georgia. The Bulldogs have done really well this season. They were perfect at home. Their biggest road win is at South Carolina, and their biggest loss is at Baylor. Now, I almost put Georgia in a 1-team group all by themselves, but I finally decided to put them up in that top group with the caveat that no matter how you would order the other teams, Georgia should be 4th in that group. So now let's look at the next group. It's a group of good teams. These teams have won at home for the most part, and they've had a few decent road wins as well. Like the previous group, you could probably rearrange these teams as you see fit, and it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. I'll also say that this group is going to benefit the most from the upcoming conference tournaments, where they'll each get a chance to demonstrate on a neutral set of horses whether they are better or worse than their peers. The number 5 team is Auburn. The Tigers ended the season with 1 home loss and 4 road losses. Like the other teams in this group, their best victories and their worst losses came at home. The Tigers' biggest win on the road is probably at UT Martin. Auburn just missed out on being in the group of great teams because of that SMU loss at home. Number 6 is South Carolina. The Gamecocks lost twice at home to Texas A&M and Georgia, but they beat Auburn and Oklahoma State at home. Their biggest victory away from home is a neutral site win over unranked Fresno State. At number 7, we have Oklahoma State. Yeehaw! The Cowgirls lost twice at home to TCU and Texas A&M, but they defeated SMU at home. Their biggest road victories were at Baylor, at Fresno State, and at UC Davis. Oklahoma State seemed to get better as the season progressed, so I could understand if you have them ranked higher, but I think their entire resume places them as the 7th best team in the nation. So now let's take a look at the teams that are often good, but still had some things on their resume that would hold them back from inclusion in one of the higher up groups. Number 8 is UT Martin. The Skyhawks typically lost to the teams that were more talented than them, and they typically beat the teams that were at or below their talent level. Their biggest win of the season was over Baylor at a neutral site, and their worst loss was at Delaware State that same weekend. UT Martin has the best chance in school history to make it to the national championship tournament this season. If they can win the ECAC conference tournament, they should be able to get that final invite to Ocala. The next team in this group is number 9, Delaware State. Delaware State was perfect at home, but that was only against 3 teams. Now, one of those teams was Baylor, but if the Hornets could have added just one more ranked opponent at home and then beaten them, they'd be in the group of good teams for sure. Delaware State suffers from the thinnest resume among ranked teams, so it's very difficult to know if this is really the best place to have them ranked. And number 10 is Fresno State. The Bulldogs lost all of their road and neutral site meets and only won 3 home meets, but since one of those wins was over SMU, their resume gets a pretty big bump for that. The home wins over Baylor and UC Davis are nice, but their resume is judged almost exclusively by that SMU win. And the last team in this group is UC Davis. Hello! The Aggies are another team that's playing woulda, coulda, shoulda this season. Their biggest wins were a neutral site victory over Delaware State and a home win over Baylor. But their recent home tiebreaker losses to Fresno State and Oklahoma State are the ones that probably sting the most. But one unusual feature that the Aggies' resume has is their incredibly close margin of defeat. Other than their 10-point blowout loss at Auburn, the Aggies' other 5 losses come by a combined margin of only 7 points. That is incredibly close. And I'll say that if they sweep the ECAC tournament, there is an outside chance that with a conference title plus all of those close losses, they actually might be able to grab that last invite to Ocala. Okay, so those are all of the dual discipline teams worth mentioning. Now let's go on over to the single discipline division. Here are the rankings for them. Like their dual discipline counterparts, these teams are also divided nicely into 3 main ranked groups. Number 1 is Lynchburg. The Hornets only had 2 losses this season, both on the road, and one of those was at dual discipline South Carolina. They lost a tiebreaker at Sweetbriar, but won at Dartmouth. Now, I can understand if you personally feel Lynchburg isn't the top team, but to me, they have the best resume. Number 2 is Sweetbriar. The Vixens were perfect at home and saw their only loss come in a tiebreaker at Dartmouth. Like I said, Sweetbriar may have the best team in the nation, but I think their resume is just a step below Lynchburg's. Number 3 is Dartmouth. The Green are the 3rd team in this group of great teams. They have a home tiebreaker win over Sweetbriar, but they have a home loss to Lynchburg. They also lost at Texas A&M and at Auburn, but they did beat UT Martin at a neutral site, so that's an impressive win as well. So you remember how I had that trouble placing Georgia into a group on the dual discipline side? Well, I'm having trouble placing the next team, but for kind of a different reason. I usually place teams in the group of great teams based on a perfect home record. But as we saw with Dartmouth, I didn't actually do that because they really had good performances against Lynchburg and Sweetbriar, and that's what created a natural group of three up at the top of the rankings here. Our next team does not have a connection to the top teams. That team is number 4, Swanee. The Tigers did not ride against very many opponents, although some of that was not their fault, Barry. But what they ended up with was a resume that saw them lose on the road and win at home. Also, they tended to play the great teams on the road, where losing is more acceptable, and they played the lesser teams at home, where the strength of the opponent isn't as critical. And as I've mentioned before, I kind of doubt that Swanee might be the 4th best team, but since they do have the 4th best resume, I kind of have to go with that. But in the same group with them is the number 5 team, Sacred Heart. The Pioneers lost at home and away to Sweetbriar. They lost at Dartmouth and lost at Lynchburg. They beat Bridgewater at home, but since they didn't ride against any other teams of their caliber, they really only had that one win that they had a realistic shot at. I'm also not sure if they ride in a conference tournament. If they do, I hope they get a chance to face Swanee, but if not, they're probably going to be victims of their own schedule more than the opponents on it. And in the final team of this group is number 6, College of Charleston. The Cougars had a neutral site win over Bridgewater and several expected road losses. If they had more meets on their resume, there's a decent chance that the Cougars might be higher up in this group and possibly challenging for an invitation to Ocala. But we only have the meets in front of us, and that places Charleston at number 6. So after that group, we have a group of 2 teams that for various reasons never really got things going, and sadder still, never rode against each other either. Number 7 is Bridgewater. The Eagles have been in the league for several years now, and they've scheduled almost everybody. Sadly, the one team they didn't schedule is the one team they probably could have beaten. Oh well. Still, good for the Eagles for volunteering to be the control group in the experiment by which all the other single discipline teams could judge themselves. And number 8 is Berry College. The Vikings' first year in the NCEA was suboptimal. They only competed in one complete meet, a loss at Swanee, and saw all of their spring meets canceled, and one of those did get turned into an unofficial scrimmage. We hope the best for Berry's program and that they'll work out the kinks and return next year as a stronger team. So this week there are no meet previews, so I'm going to jump right into some final thoughts. With the end of the regular season, you can expect the list of All-Americans to come out soon. Recently I talked about the parameters of what a rider has to achieve to be an All-American. And there was one aspect of it that remained a mystery. In the rulebook, it talks about an adjusted NRS score for the various events, but it doesn't really detail what an NRS score is or how it's adjusted. I did hear unofficially that it was a formula that takes many different stats into account, things like home average scores, away average scores, home and away winning percentages, just all kinds of stuff. Well, this past week, I got to look at an actual calculations for these NRS scores, and let me tell you, that thing is complex. In fact, it is so complex, I'm just going to level with you. You dear, sweet, wonderful athletes, none of y'all needs to worry about the NRS score or its formula. There's really no value in any of y'all worrying about it. It is so complex that you just need to trust whatever comes out of the NCAA on that and just go with it. And I'm being serious here. The amount of time it would take you to put in and decipher, oh, here's what I needed to do over here to get this to be close, it's just not worth it. It's not worth the knowledge that you would gain from it. There are many, many other things that you need to be doing with your time rather than worrying about that. So I'm just telling you, just go with whatever the NCAA says is fine. And if you don't get All-American status, that's okay. Now, there's probably going to come a day, maybe someday down the road, with NIL sponsorship deals where it will actually matter and, somebody will have a bonus built into their sponsorship contract that if they make All-American, they get more money. Because, you could see that if like Saddle Maker X had an ad or commercial or whatever that they're running, that they would want to be able to say, hey, you're not just reigning rider such and such, but you are all-American reigning rider such and such. And it would be worth more to them, and therefore it would be worth more to you. But those days are not here yet. I mean, at most, what are you going to get? An extra $50 in your sponsorship deal if you're an All-American? Maybe an extra $100, if that. So yeah, just don't worry about the All-American formula. And realize this is Auburn Elvis telling you this. And if I have no complaint about the NCAA here, you really should just not worry about it, okay? Because I am very quick to point out when they make mistakes. And so on this, just go with it. It's fine. If you get All-American, that's great. If you don't, that's still great. Just don't spend any time worrying about it. It is not worth the effort. But I'll tell you what is worth the effort, getting ready for some conference tournaments, and that is exactly what we're all going to be doing in about a week, maybe 2 weeks. Swanee says they got a conference tournament coming up next week, but nobody else says they do, so not sure how that's all going to work. I don't think they're allowed to have a tournament just by themselves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off next week. I don't think Swanee is actually riding in the tournament. If they are, I'll do something. But anyway, I'm taking the week off. I'm going to finish the Golden Score Sheet Award, and then I'm going to release an episode the week of the conference tournaments, letting you know what's probably going to happen. And that's all for this episode. I'm your host, Auburn Elvis. Well, thank you very much for listening, and War Horses.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode on the E2C Network. On your way out, I want to remind you to stop by e2cnetwork.com. It's your one-stop shop for all our content across our podcast, YouTube channel, and much more. To stay up to date with us, make sure you're following social media accounts such as Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. While our content here may always be Auburn sports heavy, if it's orange and blue, it's what we do. War Eagle.